there, seniors. Happy day one of Catholic social teaching. Today we begin a couple of days of lecture and very heavy and important content on the introduction of this topic. My guess is that most of you either have not heard of Catholic social teaching before, or you've heard of it but you don't quite know what it is. If that's the case, that on the one hand is kind of a bummer, but on the other hand, not surprising, because many people refer to Catholic social teaching as the best kept secret of our faith, which is disappointing because, in my opinion, Catholic social teaching is one of the most important pieces of our faith. And it's something that even the prophets that we studied a week or two ago mentioned, not calling it Catholic social teaching, but social justice in general is the business of religion. That's what, they looked at it as. It's what we are called to in our faith. So Catholic social teaching is very important, but also probably not something you're super familiar with. And that is why we are going to spend a couple of days introducing it, learning where it comes from, what parts of history it was really born in, and what it means to us today. It's going to set a good foundation for us the rest of this semester because Catholic social teaching is how we are going to talk about everything else that we talk about this semester. So what is Catholic social teaching? Catholic social teaching is this. It is the developing body of thought and work from the Catholic Church that really addresses the social situations that we face in our world that is constantly changing. Now, Catholic social teaching is one of those things where I'm going to share the definition with you. You're going to read that and you're going to think, well, okay, but I still don't quite know what that means. And that's because I have to give you the background on it for you to really understand all that Catholic social teaching is. But I still wanted to give you this definition up front so you have it. That's what Catholic social teaching is. But to be clear, just because we say that Catholic social teaching is the developing body of work that addresses social situations in our ever-changing world, that does not mean that the Catholic social teaching has changed over time, but rather Catholic social teaching has had to continually grow because our world continues to grow and change. Catholic social teaching has never really changed, meaning the truths of Catholic social teaching have always stayed the same, even if they've been applied to different issues. Catholic social teaching is, in essence, a proposal of principles for the well-functioning of society. These principles are being offered to all different kinds of people, and they could be adapted by all different kinds of people. These are principles that are versatile, meaning that a family might be able to look at these set of principles and ask, how can we as a family of 2, 3, 5 uphold these principles in our life? But these principles are also principles that could be examined and studied and adapted by a church, by a diocese, by a town, by a school, by a university, by a governing body, by a government. And that same question could be asked. How can we as a community embody and uphold these principles? So it's not like a set of laws. It's not a set of rules. They're not written to say this is always right and this is always wrong. Rather, it's an offering of an offering of these principles, and the question then remains for that group of people, whoever they are, to ask, how do we uphold and embody these in our life? So that's why we say that Catholic social teaching conveys these truths. And the truths are listed up there on the slide for you to read through. The truths have always remained the same. It's that the world is constantly changing. So we have to keep asking ourselves, how do we uphold the truths of human dignity in 2020? Catholic social teaching is rooted in scripture and tradition. And that means that while Catholic social teaching is not a term that we can read about in the gospel, that doesn't mean that the roots of Catholic social teaching did not originate from scripture and from the teachings of the prophets and Jesus himself. So recall Jesus and the gospel message. Remember the world that Jesus is born into. Jesus is born into a world where Romans were in power. The Jewish people had been longing for a Messiah for hundreds of years at this point. Communities would essentially marginalize and kick out individuals who were a burden on society. And so people who were disabled, people who were old, people who had an illness, people who were women, were oftentimes kind of kicked to the curb in society. Jesus is born into this world and teaches teachings of life like this is not okay, and that it's not the way that God wants us to live. And so Jesus is born into this world. He teaches his followers and also people who weren't his followers all these really important gospel messages that we know and that we've heard 1,000 times. One of Jesus' teachings in Matthew is that do not think I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish any laws, but to fulfill them. Jesus comes and throughout his lifetime builds upon the teachings of the prophets that we talked about last week. And so Jesus comes and he preaches and he teaches mercy and forgiveness and healing. But ultimately, one of Jesus's messages that we hear over and over again is that simply following the laws, simply following the rules, does not mean that we are necessarily following the world and the life that God is calling us to live. Jesus talks about bringing the reign of God to this earth here, that we are not living under the reign of Caesar, but we are living under the reign of God, and that heaven and salvation and new life in God is not simply something that we attain after we die, but rather we are called to bring about the reign of God here on this earth. So Jesus reveals that a righteousness or a form of justice is really beyond any laws or any codes. So for Jesus, really the way to bring about the reign of God here on earth is to live out this life of justice and mercy. And that doing so does not necessarily mean that we are just following the law, that we are called to do more than just follow the rules that have been set forth. And so ultimately, Jesus is killed because of how he lived. Jesus is killed because his way of life is threatening to those who were in power and those who were ultimately responsible, the soldiers who were responsible for killing him. He was killed because the way of life he was teaching was contrary to the way of life that they were living. So what happened then? After all of this work that Jesus did, was all of this just left by the wayside? Did Jesus die, resurrect, ascend into heaven, and people were like, oh, that was great. Well, back to work and just go back to their normal lives? No, they didn't. Jesus had followers. We know this because that's why we have Christianity today. We had followers. There were many people who pledged their life to God and tried their best to live their lives through the example of Christ. Some of which you know very well, some of which you've probably never heard of. But a couple of important quotes to give you some examples. St. Augustine of Hippo, someone that you've talked about in your religion classes before, known for saying that charity is no substitute for justice withheld, meaning that just because you give money to the poor doesn't mean that you're necessarily alleviating the injustice that society faces. Remember that threefold approach to injustice that we talked about. And then we also have people like Thomas Aquinas, who said that justice is a certain rectitude of mind whereby a man does what he ought to in the circumstances confronting him. In other words, to be justice-oriented means that a person acts in a way that God calls them to, meaning in a way that they should, if they are facing injustice and have a heart that is really justice-oriented. And then we have St. Francis of Assisi himself, who the way that St. Francis really structured his ministry was all about this question of how can I live my life as close to the way as Christ lived his life as humanly possible. And so Francis's whole life after his conversion experiences was patterned off of this question of how can I live like Christ? That was his ultimate goal forever. How can I live my life like Christ? So we had lots of people who really, throughout history and throughout time, have made great strides and great efforts to live their life in a way that was patterned and an imitation of who Jesus was, and really took this call to go above simply following the laws that are set before you and bring about the reign of God here on this earth. And that in order to bring about the reign of God, that means to bring justice to this earth and to right the wrongs that our world is suffering from. We've had lots of people who, between Jesus and now, have done this. And so in this way, Catholic social teaching has always existed. It has existed since the prophets. It has existed since Jesus preached and ministered and was killed. It has existed for thousands of years. But, like I have said, the term Catholic social teaching has not come about until the late 1800s. And it's important for us to understand, well, why? Why then? What was the historical context this came out of? And why was this born in the first place? Okay, so let's dive right in then to the historical context from which Catholic social teaching was born. What you need to understand is something that you have potentially talked about at some point during your history classes at St. Francis or in grade school, perhaps, is that around the 1700s, and some might say perhaps even earlier than the 1700s, there are two, what we are going to call emerging schools of thought that that people are tending to talk about and discuss and are being developed. The first is something that we're going to call rationalism, and that has been called rationalism. It's this idea that knowledge and reason are power, and that the individual is the basis of society. This is a very rationalistic mindset. It's based on facts, it's based on knowledge and information. It's based off of the mentality that an individual should be able to pull himself up from his bootstraps and take care of himself without interference or interruption from other systems. This comes from the great thinker Rene Descartes, who said, "I think and therefore I am." And this essentially meant that every thought, no matter how reliable, proved that an individual was a living, breathing, and thinking thing. And even doubt itself proved that an individual was, a living, thinking, breathing thing. And so as a result, you should be able to take care of oneself as a living, breathing, thinking thing. I should be able to function independently and make decisions and take care of myself without interference from systems, from government, from governing bodies, okay? So we have that perspective on the one hand. That's an extreme. We also have another extreme over here, something called absolutism, or perhaps absolute monarchy. And this was a perspective that essentially said that it is not individuals, but structures and systems that are the basis of society. Structures are what hold us together. They keep us on track. They keep us in check. They keep us under control. And without systems, we would fall apart. And we need systems and governing bodies to keep us in check and to keep us in place. Oftentimes, under this perspective, those governing bodies, that ruling power that is in fact supposed to be keeping the structures and the basis of society intact, is oftentimes above the law. It's oftentimes better than or stronger than or greater than the law under this mentality. This is also a time period where, or is coming out of a time period where the church was oftentimes not separate from governing bodies. We know historically that sometimes church and state were very much intermixed, and that religious leaders were also leading countries and leading states. So we know that happened throughout history. Okay, so we have these two very extreme schools of thought that are developing around the 1700s, some might even say earlier, right? On the one hand, you have the rationalism perspective. The individual is the basis of society, and we should, as an individual, be able to function with as little interference from government, from systems. Sorry, you guys, I got cut off in my previous video. So what I was saying was that on the one hand, during this time period, you have this perspective of rationalism, where the individual is the basis of society. And on the other hand, you have individuals who are under the impression that structures, governing bodies, systems are what keep society in place, and without it, people would fall apart, society would fall apart. As we know and have seen in history, either extreme is really not a healthy balance, and you kind of need both. You need individuals to be functioning, thoughtful, participating members of society. You also need governing bodies to help keep a system in place. There are other important things that are happening during this time period, and I want to go through and remind you of a couple of these historical events and these people. So as a result, some might say, of these two perspectives, we also have other ongoing revolutions that are starting to happen years before this and years after. We have the scientific revolution that's happening, and we have people like the ones that you see up on the screen who are contributing to science and to the development of our world and how our world is changing and evolving. You have Isaac Newton, known as being one of the biggest movers of the scientific revolution, talked about the universal gravitation laws of motion. And then there are others like him, like Copernicus and Galileo and Rene Descartes, who we already mentioned. You have Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who was one of the first individuals to promote the idea of evolution, who is a French scientist. We have Gregor Mendel, who is responsible for those Punnett squares that you might have done in 8th grade, who was an Augustan friar and founder of the modern science of genetics. And then you have people like Nikola Tesla, who is the inventor and electrical engineer and physicist, and who is best known for his contribution for the alternating current electric system. You have Marie Curie, who is the French physicist and chemist who conducted research on radioactivity and was the first female to win a Nobel Peace Prize. She also discovered 2 elements. And then, of course, you have Albert Einstein, who was known for the general theory of relativity and for his formula E equals mc squared. In addition with the scientific revolutions that are happening at this time, you also have the political revolutions. You have the American Revolution, and then shortly after, the French Revolution. Individuals, populations of people who are revolting and rebelling against their governing monarchy. Okay? And if you've watched Hamilton and all this summer, I'm sure you remember all of those fun little songs that go along with these points in our history. And then you also have the Industrial Revolution that is happening and is ongoing really in the start of like the mid-1700s. During the Industrial Revolution, many new inventions were made. Inventions like the ones you see up on the screen, the spinning jenny, the water frame, the spinning mule, the steam engine, and the cotton gin. These different inventions allowed factories to develop, and many people could, for the first time, come and work in one large space more efficiently and produce mass amounts of progress, as opposed to prior to the invention of these creations, where individuals, if they were to produce any objects that were being made in factories later on, they were producing these in their home. There was never such thing as a factory before really the Industrial Revolution. Industrialization makes a shift to powered special purpose machinery, factories, and mass production. At the same time as the Industrial Revolution, really simultaneously, enclosure starts to happen throughout England. Enclosure was the process of taking lands that were either owned by small landowners or commonly owned land spaces where people could come in and farm, even if you didn't own the land necessarily, and enclosing those spaces, making those spaces part of a bigger land that was owned by wealthy landowners. So I want to point you to the images that you see. Prior to enclosure, a typical English community might look like this. You certainly have a couple wealthy landowners, but you also have lots of smaller plots of land that were owned and operated by individuals who their land might have been passed on from generation to generation to generation, and people who farmed small groups of crops, but were able to still make a living off of that. And then you also had common space that would have, lots of people could have come in, farmed what they wanted without owning the land. But with the practice of enclosure, wealthy landowners were able to buy out or force out all of these smaller landowners out of the land. And so what ultimately happened, this, number one, it led to a lot of violence and bloodshed. Spaces were literally fenced in. They were literally enclosed by these rich, wealthy landowners. And this presents a problem to all these people who were maybe smaller, but, productive landowners at the time. They were now forced to look for other employment. Well, they're in the middle of a farming region, but they have no land, no place to farm. Where are they going to go? They're going to go where work is needed. And where was work needed during this time? That's in the major cities, in the factories, because of the Industrial Revolution. So you also have during this time then two developing social classes. You have, on the one hand, you have capitalists. Capitalists are the individuals who might have owned land or means of production, meaning that these were individuals who owned raw materials. They owned factories, they owned tools and ways of making the stuff. These are typically people who are wealthier. You also have a developing class of the laborers. This was the other class that began to develop at this time. Laborers don't own much beyond their ability to work and beyond their own bodies and talents and skills. And so they must go and do the work that needs to be done in the factories and in the farms. And essentially a contract with a capitalist is to put in a certain amount of work as a laborer for a very small amount of pay. And so what does this do? This ultimately creates a huge disparity of power. Why? Because capitalists hold all the cards and owned the means of production, and laborers only owned themselves. They were the individuals who they could be bought out. There were laborers lined up waiting for work, and if one individual didn't like the set of standards that capitalists set forth, well, then there was another laborer further down the line who was willing to take the job. And so this creates this huge disparity of power. You have farm owners who were kicked off their land. You have two developing social classes. The capitalists were a very few number of capitalists, but they were very, very wealthy. And then you had lots of laborers who were looking for work, but were getting paid very little. So why then did the Industrial Revolution create such a mass amount of individuals who were working in poorer conditions? That's why, because of that historical context. So we saw throughout the Industrial Revolution, we saw a lot of children who were taking factory jobs. Why were children taking factory jobs? Because children had parents who couldn't pay the bills and couldn't afford to feed their family. So children were not going to school and were instead working in factories for a very little amount of money. This is problematic because children, number one, should be in school. They need to be in classes. And education, as we know, is one of the key components to helping students arise out of families' challenging circumstances. You educate kids, you help them get a better job, help them get a job later on in life. But you have kids who aren't going to school, they're instead working in factories. Children were appealing workers to factory owners, to the capitalists, because children, number one, they couldn't fight for their own rights. Children were not going to be the people who were going to say, I'm not working in those conditions. You have children who were appealing factory workers because they were small, and a lot of these machines required, small hands. And so kids would be climbing up in the machines. They were working in very dangerous conditions, and they were oftentimes hurt or killed in these factories. Children were appealing workers because you didn't have to pay them as much. Capitalists saw children as an opportunity to probably work and do almost harder work than some of the adults, but they didn't have to pay them as much because they were kids. And so you have just this whole generation of children who find themselves working these terrible jobs in these factories. And this affects a whole generation of children. The image that you see up on the board is a little girl working at, working at a cotton mill. The individuals that you see on the screen now are boys who were working in mines. These boys were actually called breaker boys. They were separating rocks from other debris. And while this was a job that was done above ground, it still posed hazard to young workers. They sat in dark rooms for hours. They were breathing in coal dust. Their health was impacted. If they survived, their health was impacted for years and years after. And then you see in the screen, the images up on the screen, you see these small kids working. These little boys obviously don't have shoes, probably because their families couldn't afford shoes. Kids would sometimes work 14 hours a day. This was dangerous work. This work would often lead to injuries and death. Kids were abused on the job. This is really just a very horrible time during the Industrial Revolution. We made great strides in our, scientific discoveries during this time and our ability to mass produce objects, but along the way, workers didn't have rights. And that led to a lot of the social issues that our world was facing during the Industrial Revolution. Now, I do think it's important to note that I am not making this general sweeping observation or claim that capitalism is bad. We benefit from capitalism every single day. And everything that I have that wasn't organically grown is really a result of capitalism. So let's stop to take a minute to think here for a second. My iPhone, my Kindle, the mood lighting that I have in my classroom, my occasionally snarky teacher mug, which you have not yet seen, but you will at some point, my oversized sweaters and my chapstick and my boots and my scarf. All of these are items and objects that are ultimately the product of capitalism and that I enjoy and use every single day. But it's important to note that capitalism does not require employers to care about the well-being of their employees. It has a supply and demand system. And at this period in time, during the Industrial Revolution, if there were a lot of laborers who are willing to come to work for you, then you have to pay very little to get these people to work for you, which led to a situation that for a long time led to working conditions that were frankly intolerable. It led to situations where workers or laborers faced injustice problems. Okay? So that's where I'm coming from. So as a reminder now, we have all of these revolutions that are happening. We have the scientific revolution, we have the agricultural revolution, we have political revolutions, but most significantly and importantly, we have the industrial revolutions. These revolutions make way for a consequential religious revolution. Okay, so I've just shared with you all of these revolutions that are happening. We did a review really of what's happening historically. We're now in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. We've talked about, a few hundred years of history. We're now in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. And finally, this leads us to what some might call a religious revolution. What you need to know is that religion is constantly reacting and responding to the world around it. It always has, and it continues to this very day. By this, we mean that people at this time period start to have views on what's happening in the world in light of their faith. And I want to point out 4 different viewpoints that people perhaps might have had in the midst of the Industrial Revolution and in light of all these other revolutions that have happened. On the one hand, you have the perspective of, meh, that's okay. That's fine. What's happening in the world isn't affecting me. It doesn't bother me. I'm not really being impacted one way or another. So I'm just going to choose not to care about, the Industrial Revolution because I'm fine, or about the Scientific Revolution because, who really cares? I don't need to worry about any of that. Today, we might call this a privileged response because how nice for you that you don't have to worry about the suffering of other people. But, thousands of people around the world were suffering. So there's that. So on the one hand, you have that response, the people who just don't care because it's not affecting them. On the other hand, you have a different response. You have the response of people who believe that our world has not gone far enough. We have not advanced far enough, and we need to continue to advance, and continued change is essential to the revolution. And this is where we start to see ideas like socialism or extreme collectivism, where there's a priority placed on group goals over individual goals, or communism. Karl Marx is a big proponent of this mentality. And while Karl Marx was not the only communist, he was the author of the Communist Manifesto, which was one of the most political pamphlets in world history. And it became the leading intellectual of communism. In communism's foundation or foundational idea was that all means of production would first be owned by the state rather than individual persons, and when the state fades away, it would be owned as a community. There would be no private property because all of that would be eliminated, because according to this theory, private property and wealth is really the source of inequality. So Marx ultimately believed at one point that there would be this upheaval and this huge revolt against the labor class. So regardless, Karl Marx is also famous for believing that religion is the opiate of the masses. That's a quote that is famous of Karl Marx. Karl Marx saw religion as holding people back. He was famously atheistic. He believed that religion acts as this oppressive force that prevents people from ever wanting to revolt or change the ways of this world, change the injustice that our world is facing, because religion instills this mentality in people that even if things aren't good in this life, that there is another life to be had beyond this, and that makes people perhaps unwilling to contribute to this world. So Karl Marx had lots of reasons for being an atheist, but he really ultimately felt that religion acts like this drug that keeps laborers from rising up and revolting and overthrowing their oppressors. And if we were to ever going to, progress, we need to drop religion because it's directly related with complacency and thoughtlessness. Okay, so that was Karl Marx. You had people who were on that perspective of religion at this time period. You also had people like Frederick and Marie Osmond, who long for the good old days, who believe that we've gone too far in these revolutions, who believe that our world has advanced way further than it should have. We're at a point now where it's unhealthy. And for us to truly go back to a better world, we should go back to the good old days. We should go back to fewer advancements, fewer progressions. Frederick and Marie Osmond are famous because they began the Vincent de Paul Society. They took in collections and they would personally offer individuals charities. So they were the origins of that. But they were individuals who fell under this perspective of our world has progressed way too far and we need to stop and we need to go back to the way things once were, because then all these problems that our world is facing right now in the midst of the Industrial Revolution, they would have been solved. So you have that perspective. Finally, you have the perspective of Pope Leo XIII, who said, let's stop. Let's consider what's good about our world today, and let's consider what's bad. And this fourth response by Pope Leo XIII was an invitation to be rational, to be logical, to embrace the newness and the advances that our world at this point was experiencing, while also critically looking at our world and saying things are not perfect, and our faith should compel us to act and work to change that. And so that is the response that Pope Leo really invited Catholics and Christians to at this time. And Pope Leo, while he, in many ways, and we'll talk about this the next time we have an e-learning lesson, in many ways, Pope Leo looked at the issues that Karl Marx had with the world and agreed that these were problems. In many ways, Pope Leo XIII and Karl Marx saw similar problems with the world, but obviously had quite different ways of thinking how we should handle them. Pope Leo felt that really all of these responses are okay, except for this first one. It's not okay to sit idly by and do nothing while our world is changing and people are in need. So Pope Leo gives us this fourth response of how should our faith enlighten our reaction and our response to the world today. I would argue that this is still a really important perspective, and this is still a really important invitation to consider what's good, what's bad, and let our faith really enlighten our decision making as we go forward.